Hey, welcome to the podcast. We are talking about why, our brand new series, and we are going into episode 1, which is why God. So our verse for this series is Psalm 14:1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And so we're going to jump into our points for the message today and present some questions for you guys to discuss amongst your groups.
All right, so point 1 in our notes is because a life not surrendered to God leads to destruction. And so, this is one of those things that a lot of people believe that God is out there trying to take joy, take fun out of their lives. And the truth is that the things God tells us to do are for our benefit. They're for our good. And so Matthew 7:26 and 27 says, "But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall." And so, we're just trying to think through how God is giving us the instructions that he gives us because he loves us, because he cares about us, because he doesn't want us to fall. And so, we're trying to build a life that lasts. We're trying to build a life that isn't vulnerable to all the things that happen when we don't listen to what God has told us to do.
And I think it's worth noting that a lot of times we think that we know enough to know, like, if this is a good idea and if this isn't. But, like, the God of the universe is the one saying, hey, this is a bad idea. And I think that though we think that we know it all, we may want to glean off of the wisdom of the creator of the universe. That's what I always have to come back to whenever it's just like, it seems weird that God mentions this, but it's just like, he might just happen to know a little bit more.
Yeah. Turns out that guy's kind of smart for, crazy. Yeah. And so speaking about learning from the wisdom of others, how about in your groups, share with the rest of your group, maybe a time in your life when you didn't surrender to God's instruction and how that maybe didn't work out so well for you. And so moving on to point 2, because a life not centered on God leads to emptiness. And so for our scripture this morning, it comes from Ecclesiastes. And this is Solomon talking about how he pursued happiness in all these different things, whether it was women, buildings, satisfaction in work, in laughter, in wine, in all kinds of things, pursuing just some kind of happiness. And ultimately, he found it was disappointing. And so it kind of comes back to what you were saying, that sometimes, we think we know better. We think we know what's going to lead to fulfillment, and then we don't. It turns out to not be what we thought it was going to be.
And I think sometimes we find ourselves in those moments thinking that there's just nothing then that will satisfy us, right? Like, sometimes I think it's hard for us to understand, decide, figure out that God is like the missing piece in that for us, because we think that all of these things are things that we can partake in, that those are things that obviously we've tried everything, and no, we haven't.
Yeah, exactly. And so in your groups, we want to think through, there's all these things here that Solomon says that he tried and that did not fulfill him. I want you to share with your group for a minute things that you've done that you did find were fulfilling for you and meaningful for you. And just take some time and share that with the rest of your group.
All right, and that brings us to point number 3, because a life without God leads to hopelessness. And we use some scripture from John here about just the way that the world approaches Jesus and how they will refuse him, and what is to befall them, and that is a hopelessness, right? Like, I think that many of us can attest that there's been times in our lives probably where we've been at the end of our rope, but the thing that keeps us hanging on is this hope in Jesus. Like, sometimes that is the very last thing that we have. And so I think that there's probably many of us who can attest that a life without God does lead to hopelessness, and where we could potentially be right now without that hope that we have in Jesus, right?
Yeah, exactly. I know there have been times for me when I've thought, I don't know how unbelievers survive these kinds of things, when I'm like, if God wasn't real, I would have to give up. I'd have to just throw in the towel. Because there are times when things are they're so tough. It feels like there's nothing on the other side. There's no way to get to something better.
Yeah. So this might be kind of a tougher one to maybe be really vulnerable about in your groups, or maybe this is something that gets you really excited about talking about the things that God's done in your life. But take some time and talk about just maybe those moments where like you've been there, you've been at the end of that rope, but like God kept you hanging on, you know? So I think that would be really cool for you guys to get to share together. So take some time and discuss it.